Good morning. It is a pleasure to present today the first Guillermo Calvo lecture to be published in Economía, the journal of La SEA. When I took over as editor of the journal, I created two lectures, the Guillermo Calvo Lecture and the Carmen Reinhardt Lecture. My hope is that they will provide a space to take a stock of important literatures and to present novel policy analysis of particular relevance to the region. It is especially fitting to inaugurate this lecture in honor of Guillermo Calvo, one of the most influential macroeconomists of his generation and a scholar whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of inflation, crisis, credibility, and macroeconomic policy in emerging markets. Our first speaker could not be better, Ivan Werning, the Robert Solow Professor of Economics at MIT, who will speak today about inflation. Thank you very much, Ivan, for giving this lecture today. I will collect questions from the chat and present a selection of them at the end of your presentation. So, Ivan, the screen is yours.
Thanks a lot. Let me share my screen here. And to me, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sebastián, and thanks to La SEA. And I'll explain the title of this talk in a minute. But first of all, just also want to echo what Sebastián said about Guillermo. To me, it's a great honor, just, impossible to not accept this talk given the name it carries. He's a hero of mine, and I think of many macroeconomists, and especially Latin Americans. And to me, he's a unique economist that was ahead of the curve, both in macro theory. I mean, he has a whole theory of pricing named after him, and he did early work on timing consistency independently of Kill and Prescott, and then amazing things in international economics, on sovereign debt and capital flows, and then on things related to policy, going outside his papers, but also within his papers. This to me is a role model. And I think one aspect of the way in which he's a role model that I at least have tried to imitate is, you know, we think economic theory is important and that models help us think about economics because economics is very difficult to think of clearly without their help. But we're after things in the real world. Okay. So I see Guillermo is really exposing that idea that not never putting down theory. Theory is important to understand the world and to think about policy questions, especially because you have to think of counterfactuals. And then looking at the world, you get inspired to think about new ideas and theory. And that's something that, took me a while to get a sort of accustomed to, but I try and do that, and I think he's an incredible role model. And then, of course, if you're from Latin America, him being in the U.S. but so prominent, but paying attention to issues in emerging markets in developing countries and Latin America in particular is also something inspiring. So let me proceed, but thanks, Guillermo, for everything you've done. So what do I want to do in the talk today? I'm going to talk about inflation, and you'll see what the title means. The title is going to be from above. That's because I'm going to show you a lot of things to give you a taste of a lot of things that I think, that I've worked on and that I think might be interesting. And hopefully some of them you'll find interesting. So a little bit of a flyby, if you like, or a bird's eye view of a number of topics, hence the above. And then the other aspect of the title is backwards and forwards, and that has maybe two meanings. But first of all, I am going to kind of argue that the way forward is to sometimes uh, look at some ideas that pre-existed, or at least if we come up with them again, notice they've been around, and being more open-minded towards the future to be able to understand inflation better. Okay. But before I get into that, isn't inflation something completely figured out? Isn't it like, we teach first year macro undergraduate students? Is there anything else to be learned about it? And I think you could say yes for the very big and persistent inflations, for maybe even for the hyperinflations. And a key idea there that, of course, any Latin American realizes is super important is the idea of fiscal dominance. And so, and then, other insights like Guillermo's about time inconsistency and about expectations have influenced a lot the design of central banks. And so I think it's true that we've learned a whole lot, even though all these ideas are kind of new, less than a century old, and in some cases less than 50 years old. And some countries are still making their way to them. Um, but broadly speaking, if you say if when you say the word inflation, many different things come to mind. To an American, they think of 2 or 3% inflation, and oh, the horror, 8% inflation. Maybe someone older might remember two-digit inflation, but generally speaking, that's the kind of thing that comes to mind. To an Argentine, also, 2 or 3%, or maybe 15 or 30, but per month. Okay, so these are different type of phenomena. And I want to sort of push the idea that we sort of have figured out these how to avoid the big mistakes that lead to very high and very persistent inflations. That doesn't mean countries won't go and make those mistakes again, but I think we have a lot of knowledge there. So I'm not going to go into those issues as much because they've sort of been learned. Let me show you what I mean. Like even just looking at Latin America here, in the 80s, these are the inflation rates, and in red, it means you have a very high inflation rate. So the whole continent is red. Um, but as we progressed in the 90s, some countries got inflation under control, and eventually in the 2000s, almost everyone got it under control. And by the 2010s, everyone had it under control, of course, except Argentina, Venezuela here. And so that's the sense in which yes. What about, but I want to argue that no, that there's a lot of mysteries or a lot of things we still have to be curious about or try and figure out to do better policy and to understand things better. And here's a list of things, if you think about recent years in particular, inflationary shocks, global shocks, and the fact that you end up in the debates about what the policy trade-offs are in fighting inflation. And maybe also thinking of Argentina and other countries in Latin America, how still to reduce maybe not hyperinflations, but medium sized inflations. Okay. And and maybe other aspects are just to understand how inflation comes about and what the transmission mechanisms are. And then maybe going forward, things we don't understand is how will things change when maybe we all use electronic money and cryptos, and we have much more competition. So there are open questions. Okay, that's the general point. I'm going to focus on a subset of these. And here's just a few graphs. I'll go through them quickly because I think people have them. For the longest time, we had this very low and steady inflation in the US. Um, and you see here goods and services. And then with good inflation, lower than services for the most part. That's a well-known fact, tendency. But after COVID and we had this huge spike in inflation, but especially in good inflation, okay? And you see also these issues that I was mentioning, that there are these supply shocks, sometimes coming through trade or oil shocks, and sometimes nowadays coming through wars or invasions or disruptions at the geopolitical level. This is just on the quantity side. You can see here the big shift that there was in goods versus services that had a pretty persistent effect. I'm sorry that some of these figures are a little outdated, but they transmit the main message. Um, and another actor in the play that I'm going to have. So I'm kind of showing you these figures with a purpose. These will later be actors in my play, as you'll see. But in some other things I'll discuss, inflation expectations also picked up. But I'm sorry I don't have them here plotted against inflation. But they kind of lagged inflation for the most part, and it's suggestive that it wasn't a spike in inflation expectation that raised inflation initially, although there's some question about how inflation expectation feeds into the persistence of inflation later on. Similar pictures can be done for Latin America in terms of the inflation process and inflation expectations pretty similar messages. So this was kind of the recent events was pretty global in nature. And and here you have a breakdown, but and then another aspect that I'm going to be tying into not just sectoral differences, but differences between prices and maybe wages. Okay, so there's a difference there, and we have to think about and start thinking more carefully about it. And I think um, this is sometimes called the wage price spiral concern. We saw prices rise and wages not rise for a while. So it wasn't driven by the labor market. That's a message that's kind of different from how we sometimes think about inflation processes. And then later on, wages started to rise more than prices, and there was a concern about this spiraling out of control, which for the most part didn't happen. But this is another element in the play, actors in my play that you'll see in a minute. Okay. So how does the discussion of inflation take place? Well, it takes place on many planes, obviously, like a academic plane and on the blogs and the Twitter plane and the political plane. Um, and I'm not going to be too critical. This always happens, but often I find that such an important topic is maybe because it's less niche. Everyone talks about it. Everyone sort of knows something about it. And it lends itself to being oversimplified, even if you're talking about theory. So even the theories, in my opinion, which are good theories, but they get oversimplified and people sort of adopt one and only one. And I think that's a problem. And in fact, also a problem is that I think sometimes the models and theories that we, like I said, Guillermo uh, is an example, so dearly need to understand the world, also get misunderstood, and there are myths about them. Okay. And going with this is that in inflation, there's a lot of slogans and a lot of, you know, more than oversimplifying things. It's more that, there's almost like slogans that get adopted that I think hurt our understanding. Okay. So that's kind of a theme that I have. And I think, you know, just so you see some kind of slogans I have in mind, this is a slogan that obviously has a lot of truth in it. Okay. And if you add this sentence here, I think it has even more truth. Okay. um, and often people, another kind of oversimplified theory is let's just look at money demand. Okay. And explain inflation by the increase in money supply and prices will follow. And in my view, that, obviously here you can already sense why it's a problem. I put the three dots is because money demand depends on many other things. So that are endogenous. So you cannot, in general, proceed this way. Yeah, even Milton Friedman understood that velocity is not fixed and exogenous. That was almost the entire point of his famous book with Schwartz. And you see here that another kind of very oversimplified equation is something like the Phillips curve. This is a Phillips curve that says inflation is linked one for one with inflation expectations and with some coefficient on economic activity, on output, let's say output relative to some natural level of output. Sometimes you can put unemployment there. But these are two equations that are extremely useful. I don't want to, but they are oversimplified, and that's okay if then in context, you understand in what cases you need to go further. Okay, and that's one of the themes I'm going to have here today. Okay, and so I like this. You'll see later I'm going to bring in some coefficients here, some other things here. And here's a quote by Tom Sargent that I picked up. I was there in the audience, and he said something at a Ditela talk that I liked. Um, that kind of makes the point that we have to be careful about endogenous things, and we need to think about those connections. And that was what the whole Lucas critique was about, in some sense. Um, and then the best economists that understand that still sometimes fall, I think, on oversimplified uses of simple equations, disregarding that advice. So that'll be a little bit my theme. So my theme is a little, maybe as a macroeconomist, I'm kind of quite a microeconomist sometimes. And it's very much that we need to dig deeper, like Tom says here, but into the microeconomics and understand the mechanisms. And some of those slogans really say just inflation is money without explaining the mechanism. And and I think that's sometimes okay when you want to see those big questions like why do we have 300% inflation per year? but it becomes a problem when you want to go finer into these other areas. Okay. Again, very important to understand why we make those huge mistakes of having 300% inflation and the issues of fiscal dominance, and these issues are first order. But once we've solved those and we want to understand things deeper, as we should, I think uh, being attached to these kind of slogans and oversimplified theories, it can be a detriment. Okay. And let me make clear that when I say oversimplified, I don't mean I don't like simple models. It's quite the contrary. Oversimplified, you know, trying to dig deeper does not mean we're going to throw a kitchen sink or something. We might actually write down simple models one at a time to understand different mechanisms or different situations. So that's an important distinction to be made. Okay. All right. So um, another misleading thing is here's the Phillips curve data for the US. The people who actually baptized the data a curve is Samuelson and Solo. Phillips wrote a paper, but he didn't call it the Phillips curve, obviously. And it was for the UK. And even in the Phillips data, you see the curve shifting around all the time. And the first thing that Samuelson and Solo do is plot the US data and comment that it doesn't look right. But then they circle the more recent points and they see a better fit. But still, they're pretty cautious. They say in the paper, if you read it, many people caricature this paper, but this paper did not push, there's a fixed curve that won't shift. It put all the alarms on the fact that there's many variables that impact it. And that's a bit the spirit of what I'm going to talk about. We need to come in back and think about, sometimes we can write the thing with just one variable and a constant. Sometimes we need to think what's behind those constant and what other variables are in there. Okay. So that's the theme of my talk. This is the intro, and that there's a lot still we do not understand and we need to explore more. And we need to do that with an open mind. Okay. We need to think about new approaches and also draw on some old approaches, because I think part of the success, as I'll kind of argue, of the new Keynesian in the 80s and 90s is amazing. But it also, I think, left out some things that we haven't been putting back fast enough. And that's one of my themes. Okay. And I'm not the only one working on these things, but I'll, focus on some aspects that I've worked on. But that's, I still believe that it's a call for bringing in more microeconomics and thinking harder about the mechanisms with an open mind and looking at things that maybe were discussed sometimes in the past, but in the simplicity and success of the New Keynesian model with good reasons it was successful, sometimes got swept away. So I'm going to come back to some issues there. All right. So that's my theme. And here's one way to put it, which I already sort of hinted at. Here's a stylized Phillips curve. And a Phillips curve just tells me how I get inflation. It's an equation that tells me what produces inflation. And here you have some sensitivity to current output relative to demand versus supply, if you like to think of it that way, and the expectations of inflation. And then some kind of constant that might shift around. So it's not constant, it's a cost push shifter that might shift the curve in and out. And again, sometimes we need to figure out what is behind that. So this is kind of a reduced form. And so here's some kind of questions you might ask. Does demand versus supply matter? No, not really. Only the difference in this equation. Okay, but where does this cost push come from? And I'm going to try and have something to say about that. Okay, I'm going to show you that when you think harder about where the inflation comes and you think of a richer type of model, you start thinking about these cost push shocks as something you can think about and not take as exogenous. And does inflation have this one-on-one effect? I mean, this one-on-one effect is maybe an oversimplification, but basically people think it's very close to one in many simple settings. And I'm going to question that. And I think we don't know. At least I want to leave us a grain of doubt on that. I'll show you why. But this idea that it's one for one is very ingrained. If you read any central bank discussion or speech, or you talk to economists, it's often implicit in the language or the arguments they make. And then what is the interplay with wages? Again, going back to that wage price spiral, this is just an equation for inflation on prices. What's happening to wages? Shouldn't we think of them jointly? That's a minimal thing I think we should be thinking about. Okay. So that'll be a part of what I'll say. And the gist of what I'll say is this equation is fine, but you have to realize other things behind it. So maybe that constant C is not a constant, it's a function of other things. So more generally, we should write down inflation in a Phillips curve is a general function, okay? And so this is my message is we need to explore richer settings, think about the microeconomics, think about things like input output, networks, heterogeneity, expectations, and beliefs. And all that's in this three dot 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 inside that function. And we need to be more open-minded about what this function is. At the same time, I'm trying to throw a little bit of a dart on people who say there is no Phillips curve. If you want a richer Phillips curve, that's what you really mean. You can't say I don't want a Phillips curve. I mean, Phillips curve, to be honest, is a bad thing to call it. Maybe it's for historical reasons we call it that. And so I think some people understand that when they critique a Phillips curve, they mean a Phillips curve that's very simple and doesn't have a constant, and the constant is actually constant. But if you start thinking of a rich enough setting, it's just whatever determines inflation. So you can't make a call for not having a Phillips curve. That's like saying I'm going to make a call for not having in my model an understanding and a function that tells me what inflation is. Any complete theory is going to give you what inflation is. That can be written as pi is equal to some f, okay? So that's a little bit of a dig on what I think is a bit of a misunderstanding, because people talk about, you know, the Phillips curve is dead. We're all there to repair or improve or enhance the Phillips curve, and maybe we shouldn't be calling it that, I admit, but it's there and it's gonna stick, so I won't try and change that semantics. But instead, I think it's easier to change. Don't think it's dead. Just think that we need to work more on it and figure it out. So that's what this is about. So speaking about inflation is speaking about what generates inflation. It's speaking about some function. It's speaking about the Phillips curve, if you allow me that language. All right, so we got to be more open-minded. We got to explore more things. I want to mention, since this is La Sea, that I think Latin America is pretty rich with understanding the very basics, these things like fiscal dominance and expectations, but also rich history of thinking about harder things like sectoral heterogeneity and things like inflation inertia, and maybe some unconventional things that go under the name of structuralists and post-Keynesian. And there's people, you know, like in Argentina, like Oliveira and Heyman and people like that that have talked about departures from rational expectations when it wasn't fashionable. And I think, you know, it's pretty rich with people that, and I think it's because we've seen not only those big inflations, but we've seen a lot of weird things. So we've seen a lot of weird things. You know, we've seen inflation that's stubborn to come down. We've seen a lot of strange things. So because of that, I think there's a rich amount of ideas. But again, I would critique that it's like it's dispersed in different schools of thought, and that's not good. I think a little my message here is we need to all be more open-minded and break down these barriers. And that's maybe the spirit of what I like to think about doing. And you'll be the judge if I manage to do that. Okay. All right. Uh, so that's I think you know. By the way, I'm gonna put some quotes here and there. I'll have one for Friedman later also, but Bob Solow here is kind of emphasizing what I just said. He called it the curve, but he regretted calling it the curve. It's not a Phillips curve, it's a Phillips surface, he says. A surface just means it's a function of many things. And that you can never really deny. Okay, so I think he realized that there had been a mistake calling it a curve. In his defense, it wasn't really like well, you know, it wasn't a decades long thought out paper. It was a conference they went to and they presented something um, that they had just thought about, and it was hugely influential, and it went from there. All right, so I will talk about my work mainly. Here and there, I'll mention some other things. There's a lot of other interesting things. Here is some evidence that I've slipped into writing about inflation for quite some time. I didn't realize it. I have some other papers I didn't put up here, but and I will be talking about a subset, so don't worry, not the whole thing. I'm going to try and grab a subset that has a thread running through it and has a mixture of some conceptual issues that I think are quite deep or interesting and might help us understand other scenarios. and also some that are very motivated by recent years, so they're kind of a practical interest, and maybe they're easier to dig your teeth into in that way. They're more practical, more policy motivated from the recent past. So I'm going to do a subset of these, and I'm going to go, like I said, from above, flying quickly. Okay. If I have time, I don't think I will. I could talk a little bit about these more Latin American, Argentine issues here. Um, but I think really the frontier of our knowledge is perhaps, because again, that's a success, at these other questions. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about where the frontier is. So let me start with this paper, which is actually more recent. It's so recent, I haven't put it out yet. So I'll give you the gist of this paper. It's really an outgrowth of another paper I'm about to put out, and then subsequently I'll be putting this paper out. But let me give you, it's motivated by something I said earlier, which is we need a richer model. We need to think about multiple sectors. Our models are oversimplified in a way that it's not we want to be complicated for complication. It's saying we miss things, okay? And a notorious thing to me is that if you study general equilibrium theory, which is where macro maybe is got its roots now. It's a well-developed theory. You put down Mascolel, and I wish I could show you Mascolel now, but I have it under my monitor here. But you have a very well-developed theory. You first understand the simple supply and demand in one market, and then you start thinking harder. And there's a super well-developed theory about how to think about something very important, which is there are many markets and they're interconnected. And it's a flexible framework, and we use it for so many interesting things like IO, trade, macro, public finance, et cetera, et cetera. Compare that to macro, in particular, the type of macro that's done these days. It's incredibly fantastic macro the way it's done today, and it's got a micro foundation. That's good. And it adds nominal rigidities. That's how I would put it. It's general equilibrium models with nominal rigidities. However, it's clear if you just put down Mascolel and then you read Gali's book or Woodford, that it looks kind of different, these books. Okay, they look kind of different. And in a way, and not to put them down, they are doing something very hard. They're adding nominal rigidity, so they had to simplify on other things. So they're not actually quite general. They're not general equilibrium in that sense. They are general in the equilibrium in that they have more than one market. They have at least a consumption market, a labor market, and then they have those two markets repeated over time. So in that way, they have many markets, but they're not the kind of richness that you see when you just put down Mascolel or something, or when you look at a calibrated trade model. Um, and, and I should say, macro models have gotten more sophisticated, but even as they've gotten more sophisticated, let's say incorporating input-output structures, they still are a far cry from that kind of level of generality. So they're not truly general. And this is kind of strange because actually people like Patinkin, Klauer, and many people in the 70s actually worked on capturing the Keynesian insights that I think are part of macro nowadays, and nominal rigidities and things like that, into actual general equilibrium without any simplifications. And they did good work. And I think I'm kind of someone who wants to promote that work and say, let's look back at that too. Remember, this talk has the backward part in it. So I will be saying that. But they also got superseded, I think, from because they weren't able to do some things. Like they weren't able to talk well in a sophisticated way about the way prices adjusted. And that's the huge success that the New Keynesians had. Okay. And then the New Keynesians, then, because they were working on that hard aspect, they dropped a bunch of things. So they didn't ambition as much, or at least not right away, having as general setup. Okay. So to caricature this, like you look at Mascolel, you see this very elegant equation, which is actually written in vector form. Sorry, I grew up studying micro with Rolf Mantel. So for me, this is, the way I studied it. You have an excess demand function that's a vector, that's a function in turn of a whole vector of prices. And you can capture so many applications like IO, public finance, et cetera, trade with that simple structure. And then you have, that simplicity. I kind of emphasizing sometimes to my students a lot that when you manage to think of something in a very general way, it's not that we're trying to be complicated, actually. It's the reverse. If you succeed at thinking about something in a general way, it's because you found a way to to see it easily, to see it simply, and to understand it insightfully, and to understand the actual economics then. So my point is that often when a symptom that we are not able to do the general case or things like that, often is we don't have a complete understanding. And sometimes when you manage to write things down in the most general ways, you found the trick to do it. That means now you actually found a way to make things easier, not harder. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's, I think, true that when you understand something at a general level, you've made it easier. Think of things like the Pigouvian principle. That's a very simple but very general idea. And because we understand it at a level of generality is because it's simple, all right? And so without putting down all the amazing things we've accomplished or people before me have accomplished in macro, really, um, it's fair to say, I think, that macro is a series of long examples, and it doesn't look with the same elegance. Here I use the other equation, and here I use this other thing, and I got to bring this in, and you don't just say, okay, there's some demand curves, and we have to think of the markets clearing, and that's it. And I think that is, something we need to work on. So that's my first thing. I'm not going to spend too much detail here, but I want to convey the basics of this before, because it speaks to that Phillips curve idea that we want the general thing, and we want it to have economic insight. All right. So let me try and here's a little timeline. We don't spend much time on this, but I sort of mentioned this literature and then the amazing work here that actually done in part by these two Argentines and many others here. There's a lot, people who worked that amazing work here. But a lot of the, I think, type of work that was being trying to be done here was left behind. And this project that I'm going to talk about very briefly really is trying to go back to this and taking the best of the New Keynesian models and the best of what these guys had and combining them. And when you find the trick to do it, it actually snaps into place and it's easy. It's not harder. It's more general and more intuitive, which is something I really care about. Okay, so that's the idea of this project, which will have this title, I hope, and reconnect general equilibrium to macro. Okay, and so we're going to have a very general model, and we will have Calvo pricing in honor of Guillermo. Guillermo did an amazing thing, by the way, in that model. He moved on to other things, and then he realized all the citations he had. And but why is it so amazing? Is that it's tractable, and you can then do more sophisticated things, harder things, but he really found a trick that allowed us to do that and then be more complicated on other margins, which is what I'm going to do here. Okay, so it's an amazing trick, and I think what happened with that trick, it revolutionized macro, and so did Julio Rothenberg's tricks. But and we've been benefiting from that for a long time. But it's time to put that in a more general framework. It took time to understand how to do it in a simple framework. And this is the purpose of this paper, is putting it in a framework that looks just like you just put down Mascolo, okay? This method was developed for this paper that's on stability of general equilibrium, tâtonnement. I'm not going to get into that, but the follow-up is going to be a purely macro angle. So let me show you the basics and jump to the kind of conclusion. The model, again, is a general equilibrium model. So you have this kind of notation that X are purchases of a vector and Y are sales. So you can think of this as demand and supply. And as usual, in general equilibrium theory, we work with the difference, which we call net demand or excess demand. And we have any number of goods, any number of households, any number of firms. It's very important when you think of many goods is to realize that includes labor. So labor is another good here. Okay. And they could be connected across firms in many ways, etc. All right. And that kind of generality is captured with this kind of vector notation sometimes that takes getting used to. I'm not going to go into detail today. I just want to flash it up so you sort of might recognize it and remember your time studying this. But firms are maximizing their profits subject to some production function set that captures their technology. That gives them an excess demand function for each firm. Likewise, households have some preferences over their consumption, and they have some endowments, so they have some preference over their net demands. And then they have a budget constraint, and they also maximize, they get some net demand. And now what we do is we add up both of these, and we add up across all the households, all the firms, and we get a total excess demand. And then, boom, we set this excess demand function, which is a vector, as a function of a vector. So these are really n equations that nodes to 0. That's what general equilibrium is all about. Okay, this was a quick review. Now, to do macro, and the big step that the new Keynesians took was let's think about market power, and this easy way that they did it, which took the development of it, which was Dixit-Stiglitz, was to add product differentiation. So for every good that we speak of, maybe it's white bread, there's a variety of bread, and people have some market power over that. That's the trick. So we do the same thing. We're going to keep the generality at the level of the many goods, but within a good, we're going to play the same game that trade theory plays, that growth theory plays, etc., that there's a bunch of varieties within that good. Okay, and those varieties are omega here. Okay, and then we're going to assume there's always one side of the market that's differentiated and is in charge of that variety, and the other side of the market that is fungible. So think if it's bakeries and bread, the bakeries are differentiated, but the bakers don't care what customer they get. They're fungible. So the green guys are the undifferentiated guys. The red guys are the differentiated guys. Okay, and markets have to clear. In each good, so for white bread and for each variety, the market has to clear. The amount of purchases, this is like, it's a misnomer to say markets don't clear sometimes. Markets always clear. It's a for every transaction, for every purchase, there's a sale. So it's completely accounting that they clear. A different question is did they clear nicely? Did they clear at the right prices? But quantities are always mechanically clearing. And so this has to hold market by market. Okay. And then the important thing is whoever's in charge of the differentiated side is setting a price, and they have a little market power. Okay. That's the key here. And then we can take this market power to zero and approach the competitive general equilibrium. Okay. That's well known. But this setup, as you can see, is more general in the typical way. You've seen it through examples millions of times in trade and macro. But with this notation, you're able to capture what's in Mescolel and to each market create a differentiated side and proceed in a much more general way. And that's what we do in this paper. And I want to mention why I talked about the differentiated side without saying they're sellers necessarily. That's an important special case. The bakery is a seller, a monopolistic competitor. But you could also think of, I don't know, MIT, when it hires people, has some market power at setting their wage. So a more, a monopsonistic market power in the labor market. And we want to capture that too. So it's not always on the selling side that you have the variety and the differentiated good. Okay. All right. So let me jump to a little graph to ease this up. Imagine you're a baker. How do we think of an equilibrium here? Well, it turns out you can think of it in a way, and this is not done usually, but you can think of it in a way that's equivalent to Walrasian markets. And that's one of the contributions of our analysis is, well, a baker sees a certain demand for his bread, which depends on the demand for white bread, let's say, which he takes as given. So this number they take as given. But they control their price of their variety relative to the price of all their competitors. So they see a quantity of total white bread demanded, which is this vertical line, and a price of their competitors. And if they price at the price of their competitors, they will get the same amount of business as everyone else. But they know that they can undercut the competition or price higher, and then they're on the schedule, this green schedule. That's the problem of a baker. What else does the baker think about? Thinks about their marginal costs. So here I'm doing micro, which I said, I'm kind of, have a big price theory Chicago backbone. I like to do these graphs. So you think of marginal costs, and I've drawn an upward sloping marginal cost, plain and simple. And how do we know where the equilibrium is? Well, it's not at the intersection because this baker has a little market power, and with this typical Dixit-Stiglitz, that's going to just be a little markup that's proportional. So usually we might put a wedge here, but instead I'm going to just shift the marginal cost up by the markup, right? And now the main point I'm going to make is kind of trivial when you see it this way is, hey, but now this looks like supply and demand. So if you think in this way, your monopolistic markets can be thought of as supply and demand. Okay, there's some subtlety in this that I'm skipping, but so there's actually some conditions that are needed. But basically, quite generally, you can proceed this way. And I'm going to skip some steps here and just say the upshot of that is, somewhat surprisingly, you can write down the conditions for an equilibrium with monopolistic markets, with price setters, as a supply and demand condition. And that there are cousins of this result, but not exactly this result. So anyway, that's our baseline. If everyone had flexible prices, you would look in a market where you have this monopoly power, just like you do in Mescolel, just like the basic model of Walrasian equilibrium. Okay. But now I want to go deeper and I want to have these nominal rigidities because I want to bring the kind of macro thing in. So I'm going to put price frictions. And here's going to be the real results of this paper. And I'm going to keep it short. Uh, you have to first solve a temporary equilibrium when prices are not adjusting fully. Some people won't be able to change their prices. You need to solve that temporary equilibrium. And there's a way to solve it. I'm not going to get into it. The important thing I want to say is the following. Let's go back to the graph. Again, you're the baker. You face this demand, and you see that price of your competitors, and you see these quantities. And you have a marginal cost curve after adjusting for the markup that's this red curve here. Notice one thing here. I made it now intersect at a higher point than my competitors. Before, I purposely made it intersect at the same price. That's because I was looking for a symmetric equilibrium where we all adjusted our prices and we all ended up with those prices. But now imagine everyone except me has their prices, has some price rigidity. Okay, that's an exaggerated case, but let's imagine everyone except me, I'm the only baker that can change prices. Then their prices are going to stay at the dash line. But I want to go to that intersection up there. So I will. I'll set my price at that intersection. And we want to ask how big is that price increase relative to the competitor's price? And we might want to call that price pressure. Because why is it called price pressure? Because it's how much people who are able to change their prices when they get a chance, how do they raise the price relative to the competitors, or do they keep the same price, or do they lower their price? So it's price pressure positive, zero, or negative. And the simple observation here, it's almost trivial, is that price pressure is entirely determined by this horizontal distance. And the horizontal distance is nothing else than conceptually something that looks like excess demand. It's excess demand in the sense that you look at the prices if you didn't change them, and you see how far, okay, the green line is from the red line. So this distance here, okay? Now, there's a subtlety here that you might be missing, which is this is not a model where you take prices as given and there's anything like a supply curve. There's a red line that acts like a supply curve. But effectively, once you make it act that way, there is a notion of excess demand that's equivalent to the Walrasian one. And now I'm going to skip a step and just add all the dynamics and tell you, boom. So we recover a very general, okay, and I think this is important, a very general Phillips curve that says for every good now, so this is not a simple model with just one good, where wages are, for instance, flexible. It's a model where all goods might have a little bit of rigidity. Some might be very flexible, but some not. And some of these goods might be wages. And in all these markets, we need to think of the general equilibrium of how prices adjust. And that is a Phillips curve. So we get something that looks reminiscent of the original Phillips curve I showed you, the new Keynesian Phillips curve, but now works market by market with the same simplicity as the case that we did a single market. All right. If you know anything about models of with open economy where you have more than one good, or models where there's not just price or wage, but there's also wage rigidity, or having or models like with input output, you know it gets much hairier typically the analysis. But all those models are special cases of the case I'm talking about here. And with one fell swoop, we can write a Phillips curve then that only depends on excess demand. Okay. So I've done a lot of work here to explain this, but obviously skip many steps because I'm very excited about it. But I think it's important because it goes back to these myths and sort of slogans you hear on the internet here and there. But the Phillips curve doesn't exist. It's dead. And I say to people like that, well, again, two things I could say. One is, wait, Phillips curve is just whatever you say determines inflation. You don't want to have a function that determines inflation? I'll leave you to that. I'll have a function. But more than that, this was a very simple, intuitive model. I didn't do anything very funny. And I got something very natural, I want to say. So you have to be against, okay, something that's this man here, who's very important to me also, is one of my advisors, Gary Becker, okay? And he would say, you're crazy. Because we teach in micro all the time, prices rise if there's excess demand. So having in your head the idea that there is no Phillips curve, well, look, I've just offered you a Phillips curve that is exactly what we teach in micro 101. And so I don't think you want to go against that, okay? Now, just a few comments here before I move on is that this might look like we know it already in the simple one good case, but not really. Excess demand is not equal to output gap. Output gap is like a difference with respect to a steady state or respect to the natural rate, but not the difference between the green and red line all the time, especially once you have more than one market going on. Okay. And now I come back to my comment that I hope I convince you that this equation, maybe you missed the steps that I tried to convey with the graph, that they're not that far from having intuitive appeal, but just look at this equation. It's a simple equation and it's incredibly symmetric across markets. It's simple and it's more general. It's fully general. You put down Muscadel, you can think of this excess demand function and you can think about inflation. And it's more intuitive because it ties in with what we teach in micro. So I think that's one thing, that not being general and not exploring things, we've actually made macro harder to understand because it looks like a beast of its own. And so my first kind of mini topic was not so many, but my first topic was to try and fight back against that and say, hey, we need to think about many markets. We need to have that same level of generality. And it's not because we want to be more general, it's because we want to address things that are happening in the world. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, an application of this idea. And also because when we do the more general thing, it'll be more insightful and simpler and more intuitive, and it'll have more economics in it. Okay. And it will appeal to people who maybe macro doesn't appeal to because it looks like this special thing. Okay. All right. So now let me tell you about a case where I really think having more than one market, for instance, is important. And here I'm going to be a little more uh, simple and just give you some graphs. Going back to this kind of shock to sectors, well, that calls for having at
Ivan,
least a macro
Ivan.
model with goods and services. Yes.
No, just a clarification. In this model that you just present, so the excess demand that affects the inflation of every good is only the excess demand of that good, or is just a function of all the excess demand depending on whether
No,
the
that's the beauty. It's
yeah.
only the function of that excess demand.
Okay.
Okay. But I did skip a step, which is these excess demands are not the usual Varasian ones. Okay. You
Mm-hmm.
have to take into account spillovers. And I'll give you a microeconomic example of that. In COVID, in the US at least, toilet paper was too cheap relative to the demand because everyone's like, oh, I'm going to be at home all the time. I need more toilet paper. Um, and so the price didn't go up enough or fast enough for some reason. Let's put that aside. And so there was excess demand for it. What happened is people didn't care necessarily to buy more tissue paper or newspaper. But you can think of reasons why if you can't find toilet paper, you're going to go and buy these other forms of paper. Okay.
Mm.
So you have to take into account those spillovers. And in the paper, we explain how to take them account. Moreover, we give you a reduced, a closed form for them. Okay.
Okay.
But that's an important question that you asked right there. And that's where I take my hat off to that 70s literature because they were all about that. And that's the problem. They weren't about price adjustment, but they worked hard on this idea that, that was the Klauer and Ljungqvist and Batinkin. They were talking about this dual decision problem and the fact that once you are not getting what you want or you're having, you know, um, some rigidities in your quantities or your prices, here they are in prices instead of quantities, but it acts the same way, then you have to not think of the usual optimization that you do when you do the Valraising case. All right. So, but I'm in the interest of time, I skipped that. But you put your finger exactly on the right question. But once you do that adjustment, the amazing thing, and that's why it's simple. If I just said, yeah, you need to have some function, it wouldn't be insightful. The point is, it's actually what the bread maker would see. It's the demand he sees. And maybe that bread maker sees a high demand, not because his price is too low, but maybe because the price of croissants are too high. So people have shifted to trying to buy bread. Okay. And that has to be taken into account in that function. All right. So that's why it's different than the Valraisian demand. All right. Excellent question. So now I want to shift gears to something a little more policy oriented, which is inspired by the post-COVID years, this big shift in good services versus goods that, in my opinion, was important for thinking about inflation at the time. And we wrote a couple of papers that first didn't discuss inflation, and then we did some follow-ups. But first, another quote of Solo, because this is part of the, my title, to look at the past. There was wisdom here. People like Solo, and I'll show you one from Tobin in a minute, were thinking hard about the microeconomics. And there's this quote by Solo interview by Mankiw where he's saying we should think about changes in the structure of the economy, like shift from goods to services. I'm not going to read the rest, but this was not during COVID. This was like in the 90s, he said that. Okay. So he's sort of complaining that the macro models are missing something. And we looked into this with the inspiration of what was going on in COVID. And we showed that when you get a very asymmetric shock and then you aggregate it, it's going to look as if your Phillips curve shifted and it's going to look like a cost push shock. But a deeper understanding is that it's due to these asymmetric shocks, and that has important implications. Okay. But here's like kind of the data that you see that there seemed to have been a shift in the Phillips curve during that period. The little model, I'm not going to get into it, but with a little graph, I think you can get the idea. Here are two markets that when you had the dotted line, were in equilibrium. Okay. We were cruising along, supply was equal to demand in both markets, but we got a shock and we demanded fewer services here and we demanded more goods here. Okay. And if the supply curves are not perfectly flat, then you get this kind of asymmetry that here you're going to have this spare capacity and here you're going to have this inflation. And especially once you have the nominal rigidity here, especially the downward rigidity would work well here for explaining this. Okay. So that basic thing, and you can smooth it out, so you could do something less extreme than these L-shaped curves. But let me explain it here in a Phillips curve language, maybe abusing the graph here just memotechnically. I put inflation here and put slack. Slack could be, um, output. Um, so so it could be unemployment or something. So we have, maybe a regular curve here. Don't mind where the origin is. That doesn't matter. And then when this shock, its asymmetric hits, the point is it shifts the curve out. So now we have a bad menu. Before we might have liked where we were at the origin. Now we have to choose between these evils. And that's, I think, a lot of what the policy discussion was about. Okay. Um, and so and then one thing you get an insight by going more microeconomic, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, is you have to think that this is not going to be a static thing. It's a dynamic restructuring of one sector to the other. And when we work this out in a more dynamic setting with such a kind of migration or shift between sectors, what we found is it influences how you have to think about policy and the trade-offs. And a very reduced form way of seeing that is that affects the Phillips curve and it makes it flatter. Okay. And that pushes you to not want to fight inflation so much because it would cost you a lot of output loss. Okay. So you want to run the economy. The intuition is you kind of want to run the economy hot, even if that produces inflation, because it helps you reallocate. So see, these are ideas you can't even get into if you're like in the world of a single good in a very, very macro aggregate model. Okay. Or a model with many sectors, but where you don't think of these huge asymmetric shocks. Okay. So that's just a taste here. And I obviously haven't shown you the details of it, but remember, this is a flyby. Okay. Now, Tobin, I discovered later, was saying similar things, but not as formally, but he had some ideas that this aggregation and heterogeneous markets with different shocks are very important. So he had a presidential address that, if you read it, it's largely written kind of fighting against Friedman's presidential address. And a lot of the theme is kind of, it's more complicated. Don't oversimplify it. And I'm sympathetic, but it is, he lacked the formality. So a lot of these intuitions he had, I don't know how he got them, but some of them are very, very, very interesting and right. But he pushed ideas that are quite similar to what we realized later on we had written, although not this reallocation part. Okay. But in any case, this is again part of my theme of looking back. Okay. So I think when we formalize things with the new Keynesian model, we went to very aggregate models and we have been slowly clawing back. But there were these insights, maybe somewhat more informal, out there for thinking about these questions that I think are very relevant today. Let me stress that because talking about the real world for a second, you think about sectoral shocks. Well, it's like we think maybe we just had COVID and that would be it. But immediately after that, we had the Ukraine war that was hitting Europe more than the US and hitting energy in particular, a sector like that. And then we had trade disruptions for other reasons, the Suez Canal and other things. And then now we have the Iran conflict, and we have geopolitical issues around the world. So we might be going into a period. Remember, it's not been so long that we said, hey, we figured things out and things are peaceful. We lived 20 years of kind of very smooth going, and it might be another 20 years of a rocky road ahead. So we have to start thinking about these questions harder. That's kind of my message. All right, now let me talk about this inflation expectation. Um, and here I also, maybe I'll call this almost a myth, but people think about, you read any speech by a central banker, at least in the US, they talk about these, basically in words they're saying one for one inflation expectation to inflation. Okay. And here I'm going to say, no, no, we need to think about what that coefficient is and be more open-minded. And let's see if we can figure that out. Okay. So why do we think it's one? I think we think it's one because, and no blame to these people, they wrote down some very interesting models for certain things, and they got a coefficient of one or near one. Okay. But I'm going to kind of point out that those models were very useful for some insights that are general, but for this specific coefficient, they're quite special. Okay. And in fact, and you might say, okay, wait, don't do theory, just estimate this empirically. Well, that's just, I'm not going to get into, filled with difficulties. So people who have tried, it's very difficult. But people who have tried, so I want to, give some credit and have done interesting things there, but I think they're very tentative for the challenges that they face, have found actually numbers that are not one. Okay. So, a time series approach could give you anything between 0.65 or 0, and a more microeconomic survey expectations, treatment effects can give you a number like 0.2. So this is really tentative. There's a lot of work in progress. I think before we figure this out, maybe with credible econometrics and natural experiments, it's useful at least to take a look at our models and what they say. And that's what I do in this paper that I'm going to show you the gist of, only with the figures, so don't worry. But before I do, one thing I'm going to do is point out that we need to think about this experiment. We really need to drop rational expectations, at least momentarily. And so you don't think I'm going to drop it because because I'm at MIT and, no, I studied at Chicago. And look, even Friedman said this. He was very into the idea that expectations matter and that rational expectations are an interesting thing to explore. But they are an approximation, and we have to think outside of that. So this is kind of a quote that, he says very clearly that in the end, this last paragraph here, that at the end of the day, things are going to look more adaptive, he says. Okay. I don't know if that's the right model for Latin America. I actually don't think so. Sometimes you get a shock and people overreact to the news. So, but certainly there's, some wisdom in thinking that rational expectation is an approximation. But it goes deeper than that. If we want to think what the causal effect of expectation is on inflation, we need to be able to imagine that we can shock expectations exogenously. And then whether that happens or not in the data, because people are super rational and expectations are super endogenous, that's a separate issue. But to even understand it conceptually in our thought experiment, we need to imagine that we can think of those expectations as exogenous so that we can move them around and see the causal effect they have on inflation. So that's what hasn't been done or hadn't been done, and I do in this paper that I'm going to just summarize for you, which is I'm going to take as a black box, so notice the color I used, the expectations people have for inflation and shift that around and see how that affects what price setters and wage setters do, aggregate that up and see what happens to inflation. And I'm just going to show you the calculation of doing that. Now, a fuller model usually has also a model of how expectations are formed. Maybe it's rational, maybe it's learning, and has a fuller model because they also model expectations of other things and they model consumption and other things. But today I'm going to focus just on this. And that's a bit of an approach I often take, which is sometimes less is more. Okay? So sometimes if you drop some things, you can go deeper in the things you keep. And it's kind of like a one step back, two steps forward kind of approach. And so that's what I'm going to do here. And the results I'll get is that I'll be able to tell you what the simple causal effect is. Okay. And the other benefit is by not having a full model with everything else, not modeling the labor market, say not modeling a bunch of things, I will be able to be more general about the price setting situation, whether it's a menu cost model or a Taylor model or a Calvo pricing. And I'll be more able to determine also what kind of expectations matter. So instead of saying the expectations, I'll look at different expectations. So let me show you what I got here. But first, I want to briefly mention that a mistake people make is this is the goal. We want to know what inflation expectations does to inflation causally. People are used to seeing this equation, the new Keynesian Phillips curve, with a beta in it. And then if beta is close to 1, you conclude, okay, inflation expectation has an effect 1 for 1, basically. But that's wrong. That's very wrong, actually. It turns out to be true that it's close to 1, but it's the wrong way to get there, because equally correct is to say that inflation is equal to this present value of output. And if you look at this form of writing the inflation, both functions are correct. And the reason you can have two functions that are correct is under rational expectation, there's a lot of cross restrictions. Okay, Sargent taught us that. So that's why there's many ways to write a function. There's like collinearity. Okay, so, but the implication is if I forget this intermediate equation, I just look at this one and I say, what's the effect of inflation expectation? Well, I don't see any here, so I guess the coefficient is 0. So you would conclude there's no effect, depending on which equation you look. So that already tells you there's something fishy, and it was wrong to look at this beta. It turns out to give you a pretty good answer. It gives you the wrong one, but quantitatively it's okay in practice, but it's actually wrong conceptually. So that goes back to the Freeman quote. We need to explore non-rational expectation. That equation, the key problem of doing this, and that people don't realize, is this equation is not capturing the problem for arbitrary expectations. It's capturing it only under rational expectations. Okay, so that's a warning there. So let me show you just on a figure now. We're going to keep things simple. I set the price for my bread, and I have a price that's constant because I'm not expecting any shocks, and I expect no inflation, let's say. And I'm cruising along. I was gonna do the dotted line, and I was gonna set the price for the next 12 months, say. Maybe that's the extent of my stickiness. Probably a bad assumption for bread. Let's say for the iPhone, it's not a bad assumption. Okay. And so you set the price for that long. And since you were expecting prices to be constant, you set it to be constant, but that doesn't bother you because you would have had it that constant price even if you could, even if you could reset your price, you would keep that price. But now let me go back to the previous situation. Okay. This one. And imagine that, no, you suddenly wake up in the morning and you read some blog post about the economy and you interpret it wrong, maybe, or you read the wrong blog post. This is the natural experiment part. I want to convince you. Like, just imagine you're crazy and you think you're the baker and you think there'll be more inflation, but maybe there won't be. Okay. You just wake up and think that. Okay. So you think now that other people's prices are going to do something like growing at a constant rate. So you also would wish to be able to revise your price and change it at a constant rate, given that you expect the price to be rising at this constant rate. That's the dotted line. But that's not what you can do. Let's say you can set the price now for the next 12 months. So where do you want to set it then? Okay, this is the kind of problem Calvo and others solved, right? Taylor and Calvo. And imagine you're setting it for 12 months, so like a fixed period of time. Then you're going to set the blue line here. And that's just very basic intuitive microeconomics. It's like, you wish you could be at the dash line. You can't. So you go halfway. You make sure your errors here average out over the two periods. Like for a while, you're going to have a price that's too high. Then you're going to have a price that's too low. And you go halfway. Okay. And you overshoot, it's called. Okay. Because today's price is going to be higher. And now notice what I'm going to do next. I'm going to aggregate. Only a fraction of people are changing their price. And that fraction is, let's say, if everyone's choosing their price every 12 months and their pricing is staggered, then every month, 1/12 of the people are changing their price. Or if this was weekly, 1/52, a fraction of 1/52. So I need to take this overshoot and multiply it by 1/12 or 1/52 to get the impact today of this sudden crazy change in expectations. Okay, that's what I call the causal effect. And that's what's going to give me phi. And it turns out you can show, it's very intuitive given this graph, that that's 1/2, not 1. Okay, here in this graph, the 1/2 is very suggested because you cross the dotted line at the half point. Okay, so that's not exactly a calculation because you do need to do aggregation, but the bottom line is in that model, it is a half. Now what happens is, here I'm going to skip in the interest of time. I realize that I've got too much material, so I'm going to go a little quicker. If you redid this in Calvo, you would get a number close to 1. Okay, I'm simplifying it to be 1. More generally, in the paper, I show empirically how you might be able to pick up what the number is by looking at certain metrics that are not currently looked at, but are potentially estimatable. And I'm looking into those with a colleague. All right, so what I found in this paper when I looked at this is that you get this phi that's not 1, but the counterpart of that that's interesting, and I want to mention, is people are right that the effect is more or less 1 for 1 in the long run. So what happens is when the short run is less than 1, you pick up a term that has to be coming from the past that's mechanical. So whenever you write a model that doesn't have a full pass-through of expectations, and it's quite natural to have such a model, I want to argue. The other models are quite special. They're interesting models, and I use them sometimes. But once you do, you immediately get inflation inertia, that the past inflation matters. Okay. And inflation inertia is a dirty word that sometimes people think, the mainstream says is not true or whatever, even though then they talk about lags, which is the same thing. But, but, and this is the sophisticated version of that. We could more generally put coefficients on the future that depend on how far in the future we're looking at, and coefficients on the past that depend on how far we're looking at in the past. And I do that in the paper and tell you what these coefficients are. And the basic point I just told you is the less you load on the future, the more you have to load on the past. And it's a very special case, the Calvo case, where you only load on the future, you don't load on the past. All right, it's a very useful model, but it has that property that we shouldn't think is general. Okay, so it's a useful model. It's a toy model to use for a lot of things. But if you want to use it to conclude, no, there's definitely no inertia, it's impossible. Well, no, you just kind of looked in the wrong places. All right, so, but the other property that comes out of that, kind of interesting, and I'm going to leave it at this, is it's not the inflation expectations of the far future that matter. And that's, goes counter to what many central bankers talk about. They talk about the important thing is long run expectations. And what comes out of the model, actually, you can see that even if you dissect this pass through from expectations to inflation between short run expectations and long run ones, it's the short ones that matter. Okay, it's the short ones that matter. And the reason for that is that if you're going to set prices for 12 months, what do you care what inflation is going to be like in 3 years? There's no reason you care about that today. Okay. So actually, again, getting deeper and digging deeper actually produces results that are not harder to understand. They're very intuitive. I could explain that to a non-economist that, if you're setting the price for the next 12 months, you don't have to think about inflation in 5 years. But somehow, because of the way people worked out their models, disregarding reality, people have clinged to this idea of long run expectations being what matters. All right, so that's the kind of insights that come out of that. And again, ooh, wow, another quote from Solow. So I don't know, Solow should have written more models on this. I think he had a lot of strong opinions that he wrote verbally, and I agree with, but I think maybe they didn't reach people because he didn't, he was an amazing modeler and growth, but when it came to these ideas, I think he mostly wrote more speculatively without formality. But he kind of admitted he didn't know how to formalize it, I think. But oh, sorry, I meant to put this quote here that says, I see no reason. I do believe expectations matter. I see no reason why the coefficient should be 1. The guy is ahead of his time. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just talk about this wage price spiral and then one more thing. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go quick on this first one, the wage price spiral, which is another application. It was motivated by what's happening in the US and other countries where prices rose initially more than wages. And then eventually, as prices came down and we started to worry less about inflation, wage inflation started growing. And then central banks were monitoring that, being worried that, oh no, now wage inflation is high. And is that going to retroactively feed back and make inflation, which we've semi-conquered back, is that gonna push it up again? And there was this concern, and people called that a wage price spiral concern. And what we showed in this simple paper is that when you work things out, and again, this takes the view, again, that I've been pushing, that you need to go beyond the one equation, simple aggregate model to even think about these questions. And it's very much like a multi-sector, but one sector is labor and the other is goods, okay? But you need to disaggregate more. And that's one spirit here. And when you do, and we wrote down a model that had this, and in fact had one more feature, so it's really like a three-sector model, had these supply shocks because we thought they were part of the story. So the kind of, trade disruptions and supply chain issues and the kind of oil shocks that we were talking about earlier. So these are the things we put into the models. We had a scarce input, think of oil, and then we studied a shock to that. And what we found, this is a quick simulation just to show you, is you can, in a simplest model, so very stylized, so don't look at the exact features, but the main feature to point out is inflation will be higher than wage inflation for a while, but they will cross. And when they cross, according to the model, it's because the real wage is going to be recovering and it's going to come back to normal in the long run. But that means that you shouldn't be concerned that that's going to feed inflation too much. Okay. Right. So it's not a wage price spiral that leads this red line to go back up. Okay. All right. And we showed also that it doesn't matter if you have it through a supply shock or a demand shock. So it could be that you're making a mistake and you had too much stimulus and things like that. You would get the similar features. Okay. So we put both features because we thought they might be actually part of the story, both of them. So anyway, here I want to skip a little. This just goes into more detail of what I already said. And there's some connections with empirical work that have also kind of concluded similar issues. All right. So a famous paper that Blanchard and Bernanke in particular produced. All right. And here's a shout out to a lot of interesting work. We're not the only ones working on these kind of settings. Let me try and insert one more topic before I end. I think Sebastián told me an hour and a half was the max, so I think I'm still in the bounds. Sebastián, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, one more topic, and it's this inflationist conflict. And it's kind of a continuation of this spirit of let's disaggregate more. And wage price spirals actually is a special case of what I'm going to do. It's the spirit of let's think harder of how my price setting influences yours. How does that work out? How does the fact that you set your prices and then I set my prices and in a staggered way, we're playing this sort of pricing game and it feeds on itself, and we might be concerned that there's something of a spiral that might be more general than wage price spirals. So for instance, my input goes up, then the price of the final goods goes up, and then the wage has to go up, and then hence the input has to go up, and so on. Okay, so think of that. And it's not just to be more general in that way, but also to get a deeper understanding of how to think. So this is the more conceptual point. How do we think about, if you're just curious, let's say, how do we think of what generates inflation? I've always been unhappy, although, partly happy at first. I gained a lot of insight by thinking of the money demand equation. And if you print more money, prices rise. I think that's, it's a useful equation because if you think that equation will be maintained more or less, you can use it, okay? But it still kind of doesn't tell you what's actually happening and who's doing things. It's kind of magical, okay? And I already said also it's missing some part, even for prediction, it's kind of missing the fact that, well, money demand might shift. But let's put that aside. Even that, we might be curious of understanding like the actual mechanism. So this is a paper that also is a little bit more just coming out of curiosity of understanding how to think about the inflationary process, what makes things tick at a very micro level, okay? And it's also part of this, I'm putting a lot of preamble here, but I want you to be prepared for what I'm going to tell you that I actually do, which is it's also going to adopt this one step back, two steps forward strategy. You'll see what I mean. So we're going to take some things away and not model them. So take some things as exogenous and study some interactions in a more general way, but having taken some decisions and some things exogenous. And I think that's a very useful thing to do that we do all the time in different settings. And again, it comes with this trade-off, but I think it has a beneficial side to it. And I think the proof is in the pudding. But let's look into what exactly I do. So these are the questions I already laid out. And here I want to emphasize the question I'm after is what's the mechanism? And another way to put it is what's the proximal cause of inflation? Okay. And I'm going to make a distinction with root causes. Okay. So I'm not going to try and blame, I'm not going to try and figure out what is the underlying policy or shock that created the inflation. I'm trying to see in the mind of the grocer and the interaction of the grocer with the labor, the wages, and how is that working out without thinking of, what is the environment they're in, the policy context, and all that. Okay. So careful when you interpret what I'm saying. I'm going to put an emphasis on things that are not money directly, but that's not because money is irrelevant. Okay. You'll see what I mean. But I'm going to take certain things as given that money might influence. And once I take those things as given, I'm going to solve the model without thinking of money, and it's going to emphasize other things. And I think closer to intuitive microeconomic mechanisms. So you'll see what I mean. All right. So the answer we're going to find is that it's useful to think of inflation as a process where people have some desired relative prices and they disagree on them in a way that what I mean by that is people have certain relative prices and relative prices may or may not be compatible. If I want a very high price relative to your wage and you want a high wage relative to my price, that might not be compatible. And in a complex economy with many linkages and many goods, the calculation is more complicated, but there is one, and we're going to show you one. And so the main point is to think that it's when people have different relative prices that they want and they are kind of in conflict, and that's a little bit of a charged word. I think I prefer the word disagreement. There's a disagreement on relative prices that can drive people to change their prices to try intuitively, just for a moment, no math. Intuitively, people are going to be trying to get the relative prices they want. But since they're incompatible, it won't be possible. And something else is going to happen. And that something else is going to happen is going to have as a byproduct inflation. That's the way to think about it. Okay. And the other element we need is staggered prices for this, which I think is just a realistic feature in most of our models. I already gave this warning. Warning, this is not to say relative prices is what matters and hence monetary policy doesn't matter, because relative prices can push, an economy to run hot. And once it's running hot, maybe people want a higher real wage to work those extra hours. So, that speaks to, I'm going to take certain things as exogenous that have a root cause that I'm going to leave behind. But the benefit is I'm going to look in more detail at these other interactions, these kind of spiraling and conflict and disagreements. So to do a little figure to capture this idea, I'm going to study the staggered pricing game, which I'll call the conflict game. But again, call it what you want. It's really formally, the type of thing we actually write down. All right, in every model essentially. And I'm going to take as given the relative prices people want. And this I'll call aspirations. Okay. These are the relative prices they want. In a full model, and I write full models all the time. I just did a couple of times and I showed you, I would write some other things to determine those aspirations. And in particular, I might have policy and things like that that are determining those aspirations. But today I'm going to focus on this red box and take as given those aspirations and study the implications for inflation. And that's again like that strategy I took before. And by the way, it's a time-honored strategy. In the literature on heterogeneous agents and consumption and savings, we often take the path of income and the path of interest rates is given, and we try and study how people save and how they hit their borrowing constraints, and then we aggregate things up and we compute aggregate consumption. And that's a block. It's sort of a block thinking in macro. And it comes at the cost because, hey, you took income as given, but income is endogenous. Yeah, okay, but I'll do it later, you might say. Okay, fine, I'm going to say the same thing here. Okay, but it's usually useful for insight and for intuition to sometimes dig deeper into one part of the model, and that's the strategy here. And that's kind of a signature of a bunch of research I've done. Okay, so this is a little thing. In the interest of time, I'll essentially skip. I'll show you a flash up. Basically, I'm after explaining inflation. I'm going to say it's disagreements or conflict on aspirations those things are going to be influenced by whether you're running the economy too hot, whether demand is too high. And that could be influenced by monetary policy, also by fiscal policy. But one further benefit of doing things the way I'm doing it is it's much more general. Even before you write the model down, you can think informally of how expectations are going to affect conflict, or think about how labor market institutions like unions might affect conflict, or think about how energy shocks or real rigidities might affect conflict. And then you might write those models down, but it's useful to have this block where you study the two top red ones, and then you leave the pink ones for the next exercise. And that's the spirit here. Okay, and maybe something we'll dream of in the future. Quick shout out, just because I think it might be fun for the LaSea crowd. These ideas sometimes are associated with post-Keynesians. They don't have usually as formal a model and general models we will have, although there's some nice models by Rothorn. But we're going to take it, like I said, to a greater level of generality, and bring in things like dynamics and expectations and things like that. But there are writers that wrote about this earlier. And there's a standout person there that's a mainstream economist in a way, this Ackler. He has a paper from 1968 that I think is very much in the spirit of this. But also for the LaSea crowd, shout out to structuralists. On some level, people like Oliveira, Prebisch, and others thought about relative prices and how that's relevant for thinking about inflation and the interplay between them. Although they often were thinking more about some kind of particular monetary policy and so on. So they didn't isolate things in the way I'm doing here. All right. So let me show you this very basic idea, and then give you a metaphor and conclude the talk. So the simple model in spirit is going to be a graph, basically. It's going to be an intuition pump. And then I have a more general model that I won't have time to get into details. But it's not a super realistic model. It's like an intuition pump, as Paul Krugman likes to say. Okay. And I'm going to write down a model that has no money, that has no interest rate, no credit, no saving. So inflation can't be because we printed too much money, or it can't be because we set too low an interest rate. And it can't be, and there's no output actually, there's just going to be endowment, and there's no employment. So it can't be overheating in the labor market or something. So we're going to see that it kind of, on purpose, I'm modeling this super stylized model that leaves no other option, so that you conclude with me that it's because people have these different relative prices they want. Okay, so let me show you that stylized model. Imagine two agents. You sell apples, I sell bananas, A and B. Apple for apple, apple for A, B, bananas for B. And I label the agents accordingly. And each period, I have, one apple and no bananas, and you have one banana, no apple. And we have utilities over consuming the two things, so we would like to trade, okay? In fact, imagine things are totally symmetric, okay? And every period we meet, and I have a little stand that sells bananas, you have a little stand that sells apples, okay? And we go to each other's shop and we trade that way. And in fact, there's no money. So let's imagine we effectively exchange bananas for apples. Okay. Right. So if you're Valrasian, you would say, hey, I teach this in Econ 101. Here's the Edgeworth box for it. And there are a lot of symmetry assumptions. You can think of it this way. You end up at this simple equilibrium there. Okay. Those are the two indifference curves. That's the contract curve. The 45-degree line is the contract curve. And the other diagonal is the equilibrium price. Okay. But now let me throw a wrench in this, and a realistic wrench. Let me imagine that the prices are actually set by people, like in reality. Okay, so I have my little stand that sells bananas. You have your little stand that sells apples, and I post a price for how I'm willing to trade that period. And you do the same. You have a whiteboard, and I have a whiteboard. And when I post a price, because there's no money, what I do is I say what ratio I'm willing to accept. So I post a relative price, okay, in essence. However, we're going to assume, and this I think is also realistic, that that's not how we do not post relative prices. We don't see in the world people posting relative prices, okay? What we see is people use some other unit account that doesn't involve the two goods actually being exchanged here, okay? So it might be something like shells or dollars or just a unit of account. It could be anything, Okay. Maybe there used to exist dollars and now we still use it as a unit, but all the dollars burned down and we don't use them anymore. Okay. So on my board, I wrote the amount of dollars and you write the amount of dollars, but it's not that I exchange dollars. What I do is you write you write the price you have and I write the price I have, and then we take the ratio of those two prices and we trade in a barter fashion using that ratio. Okay. So, and then key to this is I'm going to imagine that we have some staggerness. I set the prices in even periods, you set them in odd periods. Okay. And the prices are quoted in nominal terms. I already said that. There's no currency and trade by barter. Okay, I'm going to jump to the chase and do this graphically. What happens is when it's my turn to change the price, I know that for one period, your price is stuck and mine isn't. So effectively, I look at your number, your absolute number. Maybe I see a 10, and maybe I want a relative price of 2. I want my price to be twice as high as yours. So I see your number 10, I'll put a number 20 on my board. Okay, now I'll do that. Next period comes around, things are symmetric. You're going to see a number 20 on my board, and it's your turn to change the price. So you're going to put a price of 40. Okay. And so on and so forth. So if we want a relative price of greater than 1 for my good, that's incompatible with you getting a price greater than 1. If we both want that, there's an incompatibility. And what happens is, this is not like, this is actually what happens in this very well specified game. We are getting inflation. We're getting the price to climb up in absolute terms from this disagreement. Okay. So there's a number of things about this little model that are completely unrealistic, that are set up just to isolate things. And what we do in the rest of the paper is we generalize them in a much more realistic way with an input-output structure. It looks much more like a production economy and so on. I'm not going to get into that, you know, but effectively you get the same insight that if everyone has some relative prices they're aiming for, and they're not compatible, and there's one metric for that that we show you how to calculate it using network input-output network mathematics, then you can say whether there's conflict or not, whether there's a disagreement in the positive sense or negative sense, and you'll see that that translates into an absolute increase in or decrease in prices. So to me, this helps understand how inflation happens. Instead of saying, oh, it's in the money market, nothing happens in the money market. The prices that are rising are little labels on goods in grocery stores, not in the money market, is it, you know. So it's not money demand versus supply, it's happening somewhere else. And this model really distills that. All right. Again, that doesn't mean monetary policy doesn't matter. So I'm concluding now. Sorry, just on the buzzer, maybe a minute overtime. Let me conclude. So to conclude, let me just wrap up by saying something slightly philosophical again. Uh, Tempted to say we've made some models and conceptual points, but they have practical importance, I think. Because again, like Guillermo Calvo, understanding the real world requires economic theory. And sometimes you need a simple model because you can see things more clearly that way. This is a point that I think artists make all the time. Okay, here's a quote by George O'Keeffe. Nothing is less real than realism. I love that quote. By eliminating things, we get closer to the truth. And that's something that also Picasso evolved towards. And here he actually drew an evolution to capture that. He thinks the real bull, el toro verdadero, is the one, the last one, not the first one, that looks more realistic. And Borges also in his famous story, and I get this from my dear advisor Fernando Alvarez, who uses this, um, you know, he pushed this idea in this story, which is someone who gets hit and wasn't very educated, but suddenly becomes incredibly capable of seeing all details and remembering everything. And the gist of the story is, even though he then studies a lot and learns a lot, he doesn't really understand things, because since he sees every detail, he is incapable of abstracting, which is the true source of truth and thought and knowledge. So I love those analogies, and I hope they speak somewhat to the series of toy models I showed you. And in terms of the practical points, you know, I think what we learned is that symmetric shocks are important. We don't have enough of that in macro. We need more of that. When we think about inflation, we're going to live in the next maybe 10, 20 years in a bumpy road world. So this is not purely academic and curiosity. We need to write down those models. So I've been advocating that. And there is good company. There's plenty of people working on this. But this is something that I think there's also some past wisdom for. And I showed you some interesting quotes. And we need to think about this inflation expectation and stop repeating like a parrot that the effect is one for one and that there's no inertia, and instead open the door to thinking of that as an open question that we need to work more on. And similarly with wage price spirals, it's part of the general point that when we disaggregate more, we learn more about that interaction. And then finally, these last more conceptual points, which is there is more general way of thinking about inflation that I think is not just more general and hence better because it's more general and you can study more things, but simpler. And generality comes with simplicity and intuition and economic intuition, which I think is crucial. All right. That's the only reason I study economics. Um, and so, as a final thought, if I may, a last philosophical point, which is sometimes I'm this kind of disrupting here that we even saying we say in Spanish, estoy sembrando más dudas que certezas. We are, sowing more uncertainty sometimes by bringing these things up. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. What have we learned? Well, I think we learned a lot. Sometimes we learn by moving. We used to think we were at the black line and we moved to the orange line, right? Now I'm sure that I'm here and I was sure I was there. I learned something. I have a better understanding. But I still always have to acknowledge I have some uncertainty. And sometimes I want to argue, sometimes we learn by having less uncertainty, even if we don't move where we go, or by moving and having more uncertainty or less uncertainty. But sometimes we might not even change what we know, but we know less. Okay. This is an extreme form, but I want to say that it's not uncommon. I mean, every little kid, if you have I have a son, I hope from the time he's now 8 to he's 18, he will learn that he knows a lot less than he thinks he knows. And I think similarly, academics, we have to always embrace that. And sometimes there's a tendency, I think in other fields it's more clear, but in economics, there's a tendency that you only made progress if now you know. And often you made progress, sometimes even if you made progress in understanding that something that you thought you knew before, you don't know. Okay, so that's my final philosophical point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very, very illuminating. I have several questions. I will try to, put into two questions because I think they are, well, somehow related. I think one basically came before you present your model of conflict, and then I think with your figure in that model, probably you answer. But anyway, I think it's useful. Somehow we can see your lecture by saying, you mentioned it actually that Sargent say, well, maybe all these things are endogenous. Of course, when you write the model, at some point you have to decide what's going to be out of the model, exogenous, right? I mean, you can't put everything into the model. So we are used to start with the fiscal deficit, or if you're a political economy, with the determinants of the fiscal deficit, then money, then probably some model of determine wages or prices, stagger, and then inflation, right? And so you basically say, of course, I mean, if we're gonna see very high inflation for years, there has to be all that fiscal problem, money. But I'm gonna abstract from that, and I'm gonna focus much more closer to where the action happen in terms of increasing prices, right? But then the question that came in several models is how do you think, anyway, or if you think there is the possibility that integrating a changing monetary regime with how these mechanisms change, right? In a way, some comparative statics with respect to that, because well, that seems to be like when you think for policy prescriptions, the natural connection.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the spirit of the question is, um, don't you have to, correct me if I'm wrong, don't you have to sometimes write the full model and then if you want to get to the policy conclusion, um, you know, in two out of the four things, I didn't write the full model. So it's not like I don't write the full model. And yes, those two out of four times I didn't write the full model, I am not saying I know how monetary policy or fiscal policy is going to affect things fully. They were meant to be written to understand a piece that needs to be complemented with the fuller model. And I've done that in follow up of those works. Um, and if I had gone further down my list of other papers, most of the other ones I'm doing full models and sometimes asking exactly the question you're asking, which is what's the best monetary policy in this situation or other. Okay, so I
But
had prepared
one
a
related, yeah,
yeah.
one. Let's just
So, for
put
example,
one.
for Argentina, I have a little paper thinking whether during this inflation process we should or not quickly remove capital controls. And
Yeah,
for that, of course, I need to model everything.
yeah.
So that, I don't know if I missed the gist of your question, but that's what I
No,
got
no,
out
no,
of
no,
it. That was
no.
my answer.
But several people were around similar things, so I just try to make it general.
No, perfect, perfect.
But let me go to one concrete. So if we go to the version of the Phillips curve that you derive, right, that using the for every good, right, using the excess demand functions. So the question is, okay, you condition on in that model you have expected inflation and the excess demand. How do we think about money supply going only through expected inflation or also affecting excesses demands differently and then a clear non-neutrality result there is happening?
Beautiful. I think I purposefully, but maybe it was too much. Uh, that was a complete teaser because I didn't. The aim of the paper that is to come is going to spell all those things you're asking out. I left them suppressed, and there is a thing to be worked out that we worked out, which is how does monetary policy impact that excess demand and so on. Okay. One of the questions I see here written, and I think maybe you're channeling that one partly, but is asking how does it expected inflation, which you talked about separately, impact the equation that you wrote down with excess demand? For that, I have a very simple answer because that doesn't depend on things like that does not depend on monetary policy directly. It's whatever inflation expectations are. Okay. And that, if you look back at the equation I had excess demand today, but I had a term that had this inflation expectation in the future. And that model was solved on the rational expectations.
Mhm.
So in that way, it's going to be capturing what people think inflation is going to be. Or once you solve it out, you can also write it in terms of the excess demand today and excess demand in the future and so on. So what you're going to get is that people need to know what prices are going to be in the future because that's going to affect their excess demand. So let me give a concrete example. I'm the baker. In the model I wrote down, if I solve it out as for the baker's problem, the rate at which he increases prices, so the inflation in bread, is going to be a function not of excess demand today only. It's going to be of excess demand of his market only. That's what you asked me originally. Only his market, but excess demand in his market today, but also next week and in 3 weeks because his price is going to be stuck. So he's caring about what his excess demand is on average. And in particular, for example, if the price of flour is going to go up in a month, but his price is going to be stuck for 2 or 3 months, then he knows he might have, um, he doesn't have excess demand today, but he might feel that in the future there's going to be excess demand unless he raises the price already. Okay. So that's the way inflation expectation works. It's not missing in that equation. It's in there indirectly. And I think it's captured very intuitively. If you think your costs are going up, one way to say it is you think then your supply curve is going to shift to the left.
Right.
And so excess demand is going to rise in the future. And you might price that in today already. Okay, so that's one answer. But the general point is to bring in policy. We do that in this analysis, um, and it's a little hidden in the way I did it, but the interest rates do matter for what the excess demands are. Okay, so for example, if monetary policy is lowering a lot the interest rate, it may increase the demand for bread and
Right.
orange juice and croissants and clothes and etc. And that's a shift in this z function that I suppress the notation for, but is included in the full analysis.
Right. Right. Including affecting labor supply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a nice thing about this analysis, which is say you say government purchases, government spending in the sense of purchases.
Mm.
Well, then it's just one more agent in the economy that's adding to the excess demand. And so that you just study it like, okay, excess demand now is indexed by a parameter of policy that's G, let's call it, and it moves excess demand. Okay. Now think of taxes. How does taxes affect things? Well, through our lens, this may be a useful lens or not. Time will tell. But in my view, at least this is an alternative, interesting lens, which is look, we have to figure it out. But in the end, what matters is excess demand. And it's a simple, it's kind of leaning on the same things microeconomists lean, which is look, it might be complicated, but we always still use the apparatus and language of supply and demand. And then it might be hard work to figure out what's behind supply and demand, but that's the language we use.
Mm.
And I'm kind of proposing the same thing. And hoping we can rewrite the book on macro in that sense, in a good way, standing on the shoulder of giants of people who have written the book. But I think they've taken us very far, but there's more room to go further by taking this approach. And again, you put down the Mascolo book, or you hear Gary Becker say price rises if there's excessive, and then there's a disconnect. You jump to macro, and it's a different world and different language, and we talk of markups and marginal costs instead of supply, uh, and so I'm very excited about this new way of thinking, but I definitely didn't spell it out enough for you guys. And if you have a lot of questions, that's natural because I only gave you a teaser.
Well, that's fine, but I think this clarify things, and because we are past on time, I think it's a good moment to stop and thank you again for giving this talk, and we look forward to read it in the journal.
Thank you, thank you. If I could add anyone that has burning or further questions, just email me. Happy to answer questions. You can find my email online easily. But
Super.
thanks again, Sebastián, and thanks to La CEA. This was, a huge honor and fun for me.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.